Professor Hayek, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you here today. We had a chat last night, but I appreciate the opportunity to have a chance to talk to you again. They told me I was supposed to talk to you pretty largely on, or at least to start on the subject of political theory. And I'd like to start off with what is a very general topic, if we might. In his book, published in April in England, Lord Hailsham argued that one of the problems that we face in Western nations these days is that we have been suffering under this delusion that somehow, so long as governments were in fact responsible electorally to the people, that we didn't need to worry about putting limits on government. Now, at a much more profound level, you argue that point also in the third volume of Law, Legislation, and Liberty. I think it would be useful to start off this discussion if you would just talk about that a little. Why did we get involved in this sort of delusion, and I think it is delusion, to the effect that somehow we didn't need to worry about limiting government if in fact we could make the politicians responsible?
Well, I've been very much puzzled by this, but I think I've discovered the origin of this. It begins with the utilitarians, with Bentham and particularly James Mill, who had this conception that once it was a majority who controlled government, no other restriction on government was any longer possible. It comes out quite clearly in James Mill and later in John Stuart Mill, who once says, the people, what's his phrase? The will of the people needs no control if it's the people who decides. Now that, of course, is a complete confusion. I mean, the whole history of constitutionalism till then was a restraint on government, not by confining it to particular issues, but by limiting the form in which government could interfere. The conception, which was still very large then, that coercion could be used only in the enforcement of general rules which applied equally to all, and the government had no powers to discriminatory assistance or prevention of particular people. Now, the dreadful thing about the forgetting of this is that, of course, it's no longer the will of the majority, or the opinion of the majority, I prefer to say, which determines what the government does, but the government is forced to satisfy all kinds of special interests in order to build up a majority. It's in the process. There's not a majority which agrees, but the problem of building up a majority by satisfying particular groups. So I feel that a modern kind of democracy, what I call unlimited democracy, is probably more subject to the influence of special interests than any former form of government was. Even a dictator can say no. But this kind of government cannot say no to any splinter group which it needs to be a majority.
Is it not true that perhaps this attitude or this delusion was more widespread in Britain than in the United States? It does seem to me that sort of the notion of constitutional limits, separation of powers, was more pervasive in the United States with our founding fathers and later in the
Well, among the founding fathers, there were some who very clearly saw the very point I'm making. Yeah. And I believe they did hope, by the design of the American Constitution, to achieve a limit on the powers. After all, the one phrase in the American Constitution, rather than the First Amendment, which I think most highly of, is the phrase, Congress shall make no law. Now that's unique, and the first, unfortunately, in only a particular point. I think phrase ought to read, Congress should make no law authorizing government to take any discriminatory measures of coercion. I think this would make all the other rights unnecessary and creates the sort of conditions which I want to see.
I think that's interesting that you refer to that, because now we seem to have got ourselves in a position where the more laws Congress makes, that's the way we measure its productivity. But let me go on a little bit to raise the question that this implies, and that is, I certainly have worked in this area, and you have too, somehow on the faith that we can impose some constitutional limits on government. But are we not really, isn't that sort of a blind faith? Don't we have to maybe come back to the Hobbesian view that either we have anarchy, and I think you and I would agree that anarchy wouldn't work, or else we have Leviathan? And how do we base, or how do you base yours, is what I'm specifically asking, how do you base your faith that we can impose constitutional limits?
Oh, on the fact in which I profoundly believe that in the long run things are being governed by opinion. And opinion just has been misled, and it was the whole group of opinion makers, both the thinkers and the what's now called the media, second-hand dealers in ideas, who had become convinced that dependence on a majority view was a sufficient limitation of the governmental powers. I think it's now almost universally recognized that it is not. And I think if one raises the matter again, a situation like the one which, an intellectual situation like the one which existed in the United States at the time the Constitution was written, could again be created. Oh.
But can we have the opportunity to do that? That's the thing.
Yes. I believe there is a chance of making the intellectuals proud of seeing through the delusions of the past. That is my present ambition, it's largely concerned with socialism, but of course socialism, unlimited democracy come very much to the same thing. And I believe you can put, or at least I have the illusion, that you can put the things in a way in which the intellectuals will be ashamed to believe in what their fathers believed.
Well, you made that point. I thought it was a very interesting point, that now the young people are rediscovering the principles of freedom. And I think that is a very, very interesting point. But I think that, we can hope that, but I'm perhaps not as optimistic as you are, that ideas will ultimately matter. It's partly just the general point that I don't quite see how they can be transmitted and have much effect. And then there's partly this question about how can we get ourselves in a situation where it would be equivalent to the situation of the Founding Fathers. Will it come through an ordinary...
But, I can answer it only indirectly. I think we have to be concerned in our argument not on current influence, but in creating the opinions which will make politically possible what now is not politically possible. It takes something like a generation before ideas conceived by philosophers or abstract thinkers take effect. And Montesquieu and Adam Smith began to operate in public opinion after a generation or even more. And that's why I always say, I think if the politicians do not destroy the world in the next 20 years, which is very likely, I think there's a hope for afterwards, but we have to work for this distant date, which I shan't see to happen. Perhaps 20 years is too short. But one thing which gives me confidence is, having watched the United States for 50 years, and you seem to change your opinions fundamentally every 10.
Well, I think there are some encouraging signs, but I think I see them...
Well, you don't always change in the right direction.
Yeah. But I see them slightly differently from you, and let me just try out my own view of things a little bit here. It seems to me that we in the United States have really never had much understanding of sort of the principles of markets. Some of the work by Jonathan Hughes and others have convinced me that the sort of interventionist, collectivist, socialist thrust has always been present, and that really the only reason we had burgeoning markets and rapid growth and so forth was largely because the government was decentralized, federalized, and so forth, and with migration, frontier, and all of that. I have a good deal of skepticism about the sort of principles of freedom being adopted by enough people to do much. On the other hand, where I see the encouragement or the encouraging signs are that we have lost faith in the collectivist alternative. Yeah. And it does seem to me that in the last 20 years in particular, people don't have faith in the alternative. And the market, as you and I know, will always emerge if you leave it alone. Yeah. And I think that's an encouraging aspect.
Surely. Oh, I think people are quite likely to agree on general rules which restrict government without quite knowing what it implies in practice. Mm-hmm. And then I think if that is made a constitutional rule, they will probably observe it. Oh, you can never expect the majority of the people to regain their belief in the market as such. But I think you can expect that they come to dislike government interference. If you can make it clear that there's a difference between government holding the ring and enforcing certain rules, and government taking specific measures for the benefit of particular people. That's what people at large do not understand. If you talk to an ordinary person, say, well, somebody must lay down the law, as if that involved all the other things. Yeah. I think that distinction must be made clear. Because not everything Congress resolves is a law, but in fact, as you know, I'm joking about the fact that we now do not call the legislature because it gives laws, but because call everybody a law which is resolved by the legislature. So the name law derives from legislature, not the other way around.
Well, this relates to a question, though, and again, it creates a problem of whether or not we can get things changed. It's something that people don't talk about now, but a century ago, John Stuart Mill was talking about it, namely the franchise. Uh-huh. Now, it seems to me that we've got ourselves in, again, it goes back to the delusion of democracy in a way, but we've got ourselves into a situation where people who are direct recipients of government largesse, government transfers, are given the franchise. People who work directly for government are given the franchise, and we wouldn't question them not having it. Mm. And yet, to me, there's no more overt conflict of interest than the franchise to those groups. Do you agree with me, or I don't believe you discuss that in your book?
No, I don't think the general question of the franchise. It's what powers they can confer to the people they elect. As long as you elect a single omnipotent legislature, of course there's no way of preventing the people from abusing that power, or rather the legislators being forced to make so many concessions to particular groups. I see no other solution than my scheme of dividing proper legislation from a governmental assembly which is under the laws laid down by the first. And after all, such newfangled conception gradually spread and begin to be understood. I mean, after all, in a sense, the conception of democracy was an artifact which captured public opinion after it had been a speculation of the philosophers. Why shouldn't be the need of, under a proper heading, I would put it the need for restoring the rule of law, become an equally effective catchword once people become aware of the essential arbitrariness of the present government.
Well, how would you see this coming about, though? Would you see somehow getting in a position where we call a new constitutional convention and then set up this second body with separate powers, or how would you see this happening?
I think by several experiments in new amendments in the right direction, which gradually prove to be beneficial but not enough, till people feel constrained to reconstruct the whole thing.
In this connection, you have long been, I remember this conference at Wabash we were talking about. You were at that time giving some lectures that later became the Constitution of Liberty, I think. And you were talking about proportional and progressive taxation. And at that time, at least, you were arguing that you felt that proportional taxation would in fact come under this general rubric, whereas professional taxation would not. Do you still feel that way, and would you elaborate on that a little?
Well, I only think, which I don't know whether I saw it clearly then, it applies to the general rate of taxation, not particularly the income tax. I do admit that it may be necessary to have a slightly progressive income tax to compensate for the regressive effect of other taxation. But for the tax principle, which ought to be recognized, that the tax laws as a whole should aim at proportional taxation, I still believe in. What I, in a way, think is more important is under my scheme of the separation of legislation and government. The government which determine the volume of revenue, but the legislative, the form of raising it. Well, the people who decided on expenditure could not decide who should pay for it, but would know that they and their constituents would have to pay equally to every contribution they made. Much of the increase of government expenditure is now happening under the illusion somebody else will pay for it. So if you can create a situation which every citizen is aware, for every extra expenditure I shall have to make my proportional contribution, I think they might become much more reluctant.
I think that's very true. I think that, a matter of fact, that quotation, we've taken that direct quotation in a thing that we're doing now and trying to check out just precisely what these effects of these alternative constitutional limit schemes are. If I may come a little bit into current policy, as you know, in this country now, there are all sorts of schemes being put forward as to how we might limit the tax revenues of government. Some of them try to limit the government in terms of proportion of national product or state product or income. Some of them try to put limits on rates and specific taxes. Do you have any preference to any of either of those types?
No, I'm puzzled by it because all the discussion seems to turn on taxation, not on expenditure. People even seem to assume that you can go on increasing expenditure without at the same time reduce taxation. I mean, I know, as I say, I know very little about it, but the offhand impression you get is that these people are frightfully confused and assume that you can cut taxation and carry on with the government as it is.
Well, perhaps we should talk a little more about this general distinction between law and legislation, which is certainly central to your political theory. I think I have a pretty good conception of what you have in mind here, but perhaps you'd like to elaborate on that a bit.
There used to be a traditional conception of law, in which law was a general rule of individual conduct, equally applicable to all citizens, determined to apply to an unknown number of future instances, and that law in this sense should be the only justification of coercion by government. Government should have under no circumstances, except perhaps in an emergency, have any power of discriminatory coercion. That was a conception of law which in the last century by the jurists had been very fully elaborated. In the European continental literature, it was largely discussed under the headings law in the material sense, which is law in my sense, and law in the merely formal sense, something which derives the name of law from having decided in the proper constitutional manner, not having the logical character of laws. Now the story why this very sensible effort founded in the end is quite a comic one. At one stage somebody pointed out that would mean that the Constitution is not a law. Of course the Constitution is a rule of organization, not a rule of conduct. In this sense the Constitution would not be a law. But that shocked people so much that they dropped the whole idea and abandoned the distinction altogether. Now I think we ought to recognize that with all the reverence a constitution deserves, after all, constitutions are something very changeable, something which has a negative value but doesn't really concern the people very much. You might find a new name for it, for constitutional rules, but we must distinguish between the law under which government acts and the laws of organization of government. That's what the Constitution essentially is. A law of organization of government might prohibit government from doing certain things, but it can hardly lay down what used to be the rules of just conduct, which was what was considered as law.